Welcome back, everyone, to Volunteer Management Standards, Good Practices, and Practical Solutions. This is segment 2 of 4. So today we're going to be speaking about roles and responsibility. A really critical aspect of managing volunteers is to ensure that they understand what it is that they're agreeing to volunteer their time in, and they understand what the delegation of duties are, what their sphere of influence is, what's expected of them. Ensuring that that's in place is going to help to ensure that you have happy volunteers. So let's start with clearly articulating what you want your people to do. So reviewing your needs first, and then determining how volunteers can help. For most of the organizations, you are volunteer-led and volunteer-operated. So you're going to want to really think about, for those volunteers that are not volunteering on the board of directors, for instance, what is it that we need in terms of capacity? And articulating that really clearly so that you have a good match or a good fit between the volunteers that you're looking to get and the role and responsibility that you're hoping that they are going to fill. A way of doing that is to have job descriptions. So just like staff people who need an understanding of what job description looks like and what they're signing up for, it's a really great tool to ensure that you've got a good fit between the volunteer who's coming in and the role that's required, that's needed for the organization. And so an aspect of your job description should certainly cover the skills and training required if that's needed, what that time commitment is going to be, any credentials that would be required either by other institutions or by the law, and then the reporting structure. Who does that volunteer report to and who reports to them? So an example would be volunteer coaches. We are now in a place in the 21st century where not just anyone with a pulse can sign up and become a coach. You need to have certain training in place. So they're expecting you to have minimum requirements in terms of credentials. So in a sport like soccer, for instance, there's community-based coaching levels 1, 2, and 3 that describe the kinds of competencies based on the age group of the athletes that you're going to be coaching. Those are requirements before you can step on a field of play. Others require a specific training around harassment, abuse, and violence. And so Hockey Canada, for instance, has signed up with Respect in Sport, and it requires all of the coaches to take that kind of training. And so really important to know what are the specific credentials, but above and beyond that, what are some of the kinds of skills or the softer kind of things that we might want to look for. So this is a nuance, but will help you match a coach, for instance, with a particular age group, and I would say a particular gender. So increasingly, we're hoping to have more women, for instance, that are coaching both girls and boys. And so ensuring that you've spent some time thinking about who do I want, what are the skills that they need and the approach that they bring, and how do I match these people so that the athletes get the best possible experience. In terms of figuring out how do I get people into my club, you can create an approach that's very similar to how you would recruit a staff person. So develop a recruitment strategies that includes things like your timeline, the selection process of who's involved in selecting the people, and a communication strategy. So how do I do an outreach strategy to let people know that they can volunteer? So there's a number of different really fun ways that you can do that. You can access your community newspaper. That's a hotbed of volunteer opportunities. You can tap into the great, program from high schools that are requiring students to volunteer. So you can provide some really innovative ways for these students to benefit from their volunteer hours and also grow as a person through your club by volunteering. That there's a selection process in place, that you've done some form of vetting. The reasonable person will really require that you do some form of vetting, especially if you have vulnerable people that are going to be in proximity of that person. So many positions now require that you have a police record check. It's not law, but it's often a normative requirement, and we dealt with that in segment number 1. So pay attention to, how am I going to know that there's the right fit, and how do I know that this person is actually a safe person for our athletes, for instance, to be surrounded with. Another example would be, a license, a driver's license. If you're hosting an event and you're asking a volunteer to do driving, which is a common thing that we have them do, you might want to do have them produce a police kind of check to make sure they haven't been convicted of any DUIs, and that they have a safe driving record. So those are examples of things that you're going to want to think about when you're out there recruiting people. I'm a big believer in having people sign a letter of agreement. That to me holds them accountable to what it is that they said they were going to sign up for, including having them sign on to a code of conduct. So the ways in which I represent the club as a volunteer is as important as how I expect my employees and staff to conduct themselves. That those certain volunteer positions have access to confidential information. So I encourage all employees who you feel would have access to confidential information to sign a confidentiality form. And that, especially from a board of director perspective, you have them sign a conflict of interest declaration, so that it's top of mind of them when they're making decisions. If they are in a position of being conflicted, they have signed on to that conflict of interest form. So it helps to ensure really good behavior as well as shared accountability for your volunteers. And then finally, a really great way, I think, of espousing beyond just the things that you don't want them to do, creating a code of ethics that reminds all the volunteers and staff that we are working and volunteering for a higher purpose. Usually that purpose is to help young people flourish, and we're going to help them do that through our sport. So really important that you're looking for ways to help articulate that clearly. An aspect of roles and responsibility that often can lead to people feeling marginalized, minimized, disgruntled is lack of clarity on accountability. So if you have clarity of roles, and I just touched on this, what does that actually mean? So let's unpack that a little bit. The board of directors is really there to service the members of the organizations, and sometimes we forget about that. So, the ultimate accountability is not to the board. The ultimate accountability is really back to the members who vote in directors to serve as a board of director. But really, they're there to service all of the membership. And so the board ultimately has been given that privilege by the members, and they are responsible for oversight, the well-functioning of the organization, the management of risk, planning. So we're thinking beyond putting out the immediate fires, and then hiring, if it's applicable to you, the senior most staff person. That really is the fundamental role of the organization, of the board of directors. The board really is responsible for hiring the senior staff person, terminating that senior staff person, and evaluating the performance of that senior staff person. But how often do we get into situations where the board picks up the phone and starts speaking, different people on the board will start speaking to different levels of the staff, and that can cause confusion. It can also cause divisiveness between the staff and the board. And really what we want to do is ensure that that's a healthy, strong relationship. For organizations who have no staff, I would still recommend that it's important to separate the duties between those volunteers who are serving as directors of the organization, so on the board, and those organizations who are managing the operations of the organization. And to the extent possible, if you can ensure and you avoid the same person serving on both roles, you are going to help to minimize a lot of the conflict, the confusion, and the lower performance in the organization. Ideally, you have a small, leaner board filled with people who love doing board work, and you have more people who are doing operational work to get the job done. Ideally, there's a separation of duties and responsibility, and you avoid having the same person serving in both roles. And then we have lots of people who serve on committees, and every committee, including both the board and operational committees, ought to have something called a terms of reference. And basically, a terms of reference is just a fancy way of saying a job description. So what does it mean to have this committee? What are the expectations of this committee? What's our purpose? Who should we involve? What are the skills of the people we need to have? What's the reporting structure? What's the timeline? How do we want to make decisions? So is it consensus? And do we have to go to the board? And then what are the norms that we want to have so that we can work together really well? If you have those clarity of roles in place, you are far less likely to be encumbered, with some of the confusion that can set in when you don't have clarity of roles. So I spoke a little bit about oversight. Really important that the senior most staff person or the designated volunteer regularly reports to the board. And that frequency depends on a number of factors. At a club level, I would expect that you're meeting at least once a month. And maybe the senior most staff person and the president are speaking about once a week. So you're going to want to think about, what does that look like for us? The level of trust, the level of sophistication of the organization, how long the senior staff person, if applicable, has been in place, and the maturity level of the board will often dictate what that reporting looks like. Minutes ought to be taken at every board meeting, and previous meeting minutes are reviewed and approved by the board. That is such an important aspect of board development. You really want to ensure that you've taken proper minutes and record those so that that corporate memory gets preserved and you can defend decisions if you're called to. Ideally, an important aspect of oversight is that the board evaluates their performance every year, and they also evaluate the performance of the senior staff person or designated volunteer. You agree on the milestones. What are the cool things you want this person to do? What are the cool things we want to do as a board? And how are we going to ensure that we're not duplicating efforts, but in fact, we are complementing the work that each of us is doing to achieve the mission of the organization on the way to succeeding to our vision. You really, in terms of oversight, what I would call, one of the primary focus of the board of directors is to ensure its fiduciary duty. So you have to ensure that the organization is meeting legal requirements, and to ensure that you're also operating at a level of moral obligation that's higher than, I would say, the higher than the norm. And that means that you are there to serve the best interest of the organization. So you're watching out for things like conflict, and you're avoiding, wearing duplicate hats. And then, another aspect of oversight is that you are looking for ways to manage and minimize risk. You can do so formally through having a risk management policy, which increasingly is becoming a standard practice, folks. So there's lots of writing on www.sportlaw.ca. You can learn more about ways in which you can manage risk in a way that is really helpful. Risk management done well, is risk management done by everyone. And it can be as simple as incorporating that in your board meetings and educating your volunteers and your staff to be asking themselves two questions. What's the risk of doing something? And what's the risk if we don't do that something? If you incorporate that into your culture, you will find that your decision making is enhanced. Another aspect of roles and responsibility and accountability is to ensure that you are planning for success. It's the board's responsibility to set the course for the future. And that means that the staff or the designated volunteers responsible for implementing the strategies are doing so in a way that is leading towards that higher shared outcome. Those strategies that people thought would be important for us to start doing. If you don't spend any time planning, then you're likely to be like a very young sapling, susceptible to the changes in the wind. What you really want to ensure, and your planning tool can help you do that, is to produce really strong roots that regardless of the winds that are swirling around you, with your planning tool, you have a sense of where you want to go. You've articulated some ways of getting there, and that can be used as a main tool to help drive accountability between the board and the senior staff person, or between the board and those volunteers who are busy carrying out the operations of the organization. The relationship then between the board and staff, or between the staff, or sorry, between the board and the committee members, is significantly enhanced when you have good planning in place. So thank you very much. This concludes segment 2 of Volunteer Management: Standards, Good Practices, and Practical Solutions. I encourage you to continue learning by watching segment 3 on recruitment and orientation.